So, good evening, everybody. I'm Robert Keston, President and CEO of Stonewall National Museum, Archive, and Library here in Fort Lauderdale. Welcome, and we're glad that you're with us. Today, we're talking to Ryan Douglas, the author of The Great Disillusionment of Nick and Jay, which is a young adult, a YA book, but certainly one that anybody can read. And its basis, as it says just by Nick and Jay, is the Great Gatsby and that time period and the difference between black and white, rich and poor, in a fictionalized history, a historic fiction that really walks you through a world that almost nobody in the United States that I'm aware of, whether black or white or brown, really has experienced, simply because it focuses on people that were not stereotypical. They were not in an environment that was preordained. And I think that Ryan takes us on a, how do I say it, on a journey that is absolutely remarkable simply because it takes people who we might know from the original book written by F. Scott Fitzgerald and then reinvents the entire thing without limiting the historical aspects of the book. So you take us on a journey, and welcome, Ryan. You take us on a journey through a period in American history that is interesting, Prohibition. You also start this book in one of the most cataclysmic events in American history that remains largely unknown. So, why don't you tell us how you start this book and then maybe why?
Mm. So I wanted to do historical fiction after my debut because I really just wanted to learn more about my culture, my history, kind of like have context for the world today, because I definitely think that studying history gives you more awareness of, where we are in the continuum and what we need to do to continue making the world safer and more ethical. So I was already doing research for a different project, and then I started doing research for this one. And the Tulsa Race Massacre, which is what opens the book, is something that I feel really shows what was happening in that period before Jim Crow really well, where Black people were coming out of slavery and developing more independence in society, and just kind of how the racial tensions in this country destroyed that effort. I think it's really important history. It illuminates kind of like the issues of today, but also shows in a really nuanced way why it's difficult to excel in society when you're dealing with those kinds of barriers. So that's why I did it. Just wanted to show, a different side of history through something that is already well known and beloved by so many people.
It also gave you an opportunity to introduce Nick
Mm.
in complicated ways. He has a friend in Tulsa who he probably has a crush on, but it's unrequited, and he
Hmm.
knows that. Uh, and yet the bond is there between both of them, but in a platonic way. So he doesn't really know how to deal with that 100%. So he just shoves it to the side. He certainly doesn't discuss who he is with his father or his employer or even his friend. And then, of course, the Tulsa massacre takes place, and all of a sudden, he's the only one that survives that we know of. And he has to get out. There
Hmm.
is no option. It's life or death. and he gets on a train. And the only thing he knows is that his cousins live in Harlem.
mm,
And how do I get there? How did you decide that The Great Gatsby was a platform that you could marry all of these storylines to that would carry you where you wanted to go?
mm. Um, well, I think that the American dream is something that we are all shooting for in our own ways, regardless of what our racial background is. And I feel like because it entered into the public domain in 2021 and because it has made such a mark on culture, it was just an opportunity to explore what that looks like from a marginalized perspective, a perspective that is truly marginalized by the racial caste in this country. Because I know that, Nick in the original story is not, wealthy in the way that the characters that he's associating with are. If I remember correctly, he's not wealthy in that way. But I just felt that the story was it had a good entry into that topic, the American Dream class, but I didn't feel that it was done in a way that invited African Americans into the story. But I also know that there are Black people who really do enjoy that book. So it was just my own personal desire to expand on something that I thought opened a door, but didn't exactly create the environment that would create enjoyment for myself.
So in the original,
Mm-hmm.
Nick is a writer. In this version, Nick is a writer. You are a writer. I know you've told me that you feel that you're part of both Nick and Jay.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the original, Jay is already a grown up and is totally infatuated with Daisy. In your version, Nick is a gay man,
Mm-hmm.
which he's not in the original, but that goes for a lot of reasons, none of which has any great merit because I'm certain that F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda knew a lot of gay people, and who knows what they did in their private life that was not discussed. So that interesting tumult of what is real, what is not real, what they thought, what they did, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of bring that to life because you give us a lot of language and story that combines with what we don't know. So you're telling us things about the character because you're saying how he feels.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that he likes Jay before he knows that Jay could possibly like him in the same way. And in this version, Jay is an adolescent or a young adult.
Mm-hmm.
And his father is Jay, who is somewhat similar to the Jay Gatsby in the original Great Gatsby, without a love for Daisy,
Right.
who is married to Tom, who's not married to Tom in this version because, as in the original, Nick and Daisy are cousins.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Nick met Gatsby in the original through Daisy, and that's somewhat how they meet each other again in your version.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in your book, you take us through a lot of underworld stuff,
Mm-hmm.
bootlegging and drugs, and the places of Harlem that nobody would go to. But interestingly, you take Tom's family and Gatsby's family, and you have them create the potential of a world that is looking at equality as a possibility, even though they do it for nefarious reasons potentially.
Mhm.
Also, your Jay Jr. is his mother was black, his father is white, which should have created a lot of obstacles, both for
Mhm.
Jay Sr. and for Jay Jr. It's hard to see if all of those obstacles existed, and that was a long time ago. So it's hard. So, how did your historical references, your research bring you to the way those characters behaved and acted and performed?
Mm. Um, so I remember watching and reading Passing by Nella Larson because I wanted to get insight into what it was, I guess, like colorism and what it was like to be a lighter skinned black person because I wanted that contrast to be clear. Obviously today we still deal with colorism, but back then it was more intense. And so I wanted to, in exploring kind of like this have and have nots circumstance between these boys, I was trying to figure out, how to portray the various ways that uh, the way that you were treated is different depending on, your skin color. So, um, yeah, I remember watching Passing, and it was very interesting because it kind of dealt with like that striving for whiteness as a black person who is closer, I guess, tonally to white. And with Jay's character, I really wanted to explore that pressure and how he reacts to that pressure and how he feeds into that privilege or how he, just being like a mixed race person as opposed to Nick, who is a darker skinned monoracial person. And in exploring that, I really found, more romance in their relationship because I think that part of why Nick ends up trusting him and falling for him is that he sees that he does have access to this life, but still has interest in his black side and still wants to, be a part of the UNIA and the activism that's going on. And he has an appreciation for his culture. And I think that that was really important in the narrative for Nick for their ultimate bond.
And what is the role that Daisy plays in your story? Because it's different than the
Um,
role she plays in the original book.
mhm. So Daisy ended up being, I think, more lovable than I wrote her in the original. And I kind of couldn't help it because, when Nick comes to New York, she's really the only tether. Daisy and her parents are the only tether to like familial support and care that he has. And what was also really interesting in the research process was kind of learning about how moving to the north changed the culture and the way that people just interacted with progress and being progressive in general. Because we see Daisy, wanting to challenge norms. There's a scene where she like wants to wear something to the dance, and her dad is like, "You can't wear that." And they're kind of on that cusp where like women are allowed to be more expressive with their fashions and just like gaining more autonomy in society. So Daisy was really for me just like someone who had made that transition before Nick and could kind of introduce him to this whole new world, where you can find yourself in a different way in New York than you can in small town Oklahoma. So she was really someone that I wanted to be like a support system for Nick, but not only that, I wanted her to have her own thing going on in the book and her own storyline that was happening before Nick got there and after, but yeah, I think it was really important for Nick to have someone who felt safe in that and coming out of that trauma. So yeah, that's the role she served pretty much.
What did you bring of yourself to writing this? Because I can't believe that you didn't express a lot of things about your own self.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that all of the books that I write are pretty personal. It's hard to pinpoint it because I think Nick is similar to me in the way that he is reserved, at the beginning of the book and kind of he's kind of wishy-washy on a lot of things. And I think I'm that way too. I think I'm developing more of a, I guess more of a voice, but for a long time I was just really shy and really pulled back. And so writing shy boys feels really natural for me, like boys who are unsure and kind of, hopeful but wary. So that in that regard, Nick is similar. I think some of the stuff that he does towards the end of the book are things that I wouldn't do. But I was
Would
trying
you
to
want
heighten.
to?
I would want to go on a spy mission if I was sure that I wouldn't, that I would come back alive. I think some of that is, heightening the book in a way that's fun for YA, but um, yeah, and obviously when Nick starts to experience love, I mean, I have to write what I know of what that feels like. So that was very personal too. Just like how he expressed himself to Jay toward the end.
And what did you see in yourself in Jay?
I think that the perception of Jay as someone that is cool is I get the impression that some people who don't know me perceive me as a cool person. And I'm not saying that I'm uncool. I'm a really awkward person. Like I'm a really nerdy kind of geeky kind of like awkward guy. And I think that some people from a distance look at me and they're like, oh, he's cool and like they have these impressions. And I think for Jay's story, he deals with that a lot where he's this guy, like he's a pretty down to earth kind of guy, but because he's known as somebody who is a part of these initiatives like starting West Egg, and he's known as someone who has a rich father and he's popular, everybody has these ideas about who he is. He's very charismatic, and they want to be around him, they want to be in his energy and his aura. But with Nick, he's like pretty stripped down and he's just like a normal guy. And I think that difference between what is perceived and what is something that I relate to that character in.
So there was a lot of what is perceived and what really is throughout the book.
Mm.
They all had some of that.
Mm.
Certainly the major characters. And yet you have a way of walking them through the very convoluted streets of Harlem and then ultimately getting to Long Island and getting from one mansion to the other. Uh, you certainly create both a sense of comfortableness and uncomfortableness, depending on which character it is. And you also introduce other business people, small business people from Harlem, their friend whose parents own a restaurant,
Mm.
who I wish you would have developed him more. His character seemed to be really, really nice.
Mm.
Uh, he was a good. I can't remember his name now for some reason, but
By hand, yeah.
he was a good person,
Mm.
and not everybody in the story is a good person. Now, where, and how did you come up with the idea of the school that Tom and Jay Sr. founded? It seemed
Mm.
so ahead of its time, at least in the way it was presented.
Mhm.
And since people may not know what that is, can you explain the school and how it came about so that they know what we're talking about?
Sure. So the school is an integrated academy at a time where integrated academies were not the norm. Um, in 1921, when the book takes place, typically it was Black students, Black boys in a school, and then Black girls in a school, and it was divided by gender and race. But I wanted to do this integrated school because I wanted an entry point to look at that idea of like something that looks progressive on the surface, but actually has sinister secrets underneath. And I also thought it was fair to set a school like that in this time period because it was pre Jim Crow and there weren't really like necessarily laws that were as concrete as they were in the Jim Crow period that were separating white and black people. So things like that could have theoretically existed. There was a lot of conversation about like what the country was going to be now that black people were free. Where African Americans would fit in society. And I think, you had people who were kind of like separatists and wanted just like separation of the races. And then you had people who were more about integration. And um, I think showing the school in that way was a way to show that those efforts and those conversations were happening. I'm not sure if I don't know if like they really had integrated schools, but I think it's one of those things that is kind of a liberty that I feel like could have existed at the time.
Well, back in the 20s, also, not a lot of people went to school
Mm,
past a certain grade. And
mm,
this school, they certainly did.
mm,
But also, as you point out, the driving force wasn't what it appeared in the brochure that sold the school, nor was it what the students experienced. And that was another entry point for Nick to become an activist,
mm,
that he recognized almost instantaneously the divide between black and white students, the living accommodations, the courses that they were allowed to take. So even though the school was on paper integrated, their housing wasn't integrated, their classes weren't integrated, their
mm,
experiences weren't integrated. So although they may have shared part of a campus, that was really the only part of their lives that were entangled.
mm. Yeah, and that made it feel more real too, because it's a facade. So you're experiencing, the divides of the time once he gets to the school, but it looks progressive on the surface.
And we didn't really see the girls' school.
Yeah, no. I had like so many ideas. I was like, let me try to focus it, on where we are with the boys.
So the focus is on obviously on Jay and Nick, uh, who come from different worlds. Jay is, because of his father, is in the white school,
Mm,
and Nick, because of his upbringing, is in the black school. How
mm,
much of that divide before introducing Nick to Jay was Jay fully aware of, and how uncomfortable it's not never really clear if he's
mm,
uncomfortable with that division.
mm, That is a great question. I think that, well, this is just my take because it isn't on the page. My perception is that meeting Nick is a catalyst for Jay to start thinking about these things more seriously. I think we see a lot of just like these boys inheriting what their fathers are passing down to them. So I think before meeting Nick, I don't know that Jay is like necessarily like against the structure in the school. I think that Nick's experience and seeing that and being made aware of that changes how he feels about it. I think Jay is kind of someone who goes through the motions toward the beginning of the book and just changes changes his, I guess, level of action toward those issues. Like on a micro level, I think that he's thinking, well, it's a good thing because it's integrated, but having Nick introduced to the narrative and seeing kind of like the reality of that, I think changes his mind. That's my take on it because I know I didn't write it in the book, but yeah, that's
Well,
what I would.
but not writing it doesn't mean it's not there.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I think it's for me it is the subtext that Nick's behaviors and his thoughts and his drive to make things fairer kind of inspires Jay.
Now, Nick also comes to this from a rarefied position for a black young man from Oklahoma. His
Mm-hmm.
father was a writer, his grandfather was a writer. Um, so that's already very uncommon. They were not poor. So he came to New York with academic ish background, although he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't necessarily all that interested in being a great student. It's he certainly was not he was not ignorant and he wanted to write.
Mm-hmm.
Whether someone would let him write was another issue. His father seemed to think that he wasn't ready.
Mm-hmm.
But his father is finished by early on in the book, so his
Yeah.
opportunity to write happened sooner than he might have even been prepared for it. But his wanting to write, his ability to write, was not something that the community was willing to tolerate because it wasn't really an equal situation at the school or at the school paper. And then
Mm.
what happens when he challenges the status quo?
Are
That
you
is a
asking
question.
me? Oh, um, like what happens in the book?
What happens? How do you come to those places? I mean, I'm more interested in what you're thinking because I think that when you read the book, it's there. A lot of it is there. But I think that what you're saying now about your characters and the way things move,
Mm-hmm.
getting that insight is really fascinating because at one point anyway, you knew these people inside and out because you were writing their words, you were feeling their thoughts. And he goes through so much when he wants to write for the paper. He goes through so much when he decides that he's going to start his own paper. He's willing to take on an awful lot of risk for someone who has just gone through so much trauma.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that is does he feel is an obligation to his people, to himself, to the memory of his father,
Mm-hmm.
to the memory of his friend? Where does it all come from that he has taken on from being the shy boy, the boy who stays in the background, to being a
Mm-hmm.
provocateur in a way?
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, I think that because Nick came from Greenwood, which was Black Wall Street, it was a very prosperous town and it was an all-black town. And, you could be a writer, you could be an artist. Everybody had kind of like a trade that they were inheriting, usually, or maybe not, but there was opportunity and there was promise. I think that when Nick goes to New York and he sees that they're trying to make him into an elevator operator and they're saying, well, you're destined for blue collar work, it it's a clash for him in a way that maybe it wouldn't have clashed if he hadn't come from that environment where, he saw Black people thriving and Black success was the norm. So I think in that moment where Nick is like, what's going on? And when they say you're going to be an elevator operator and they take him to, the rundown dorm, and he's just like confused because he's like, what is this? Like, I'm not, because at the beginning, his father doesn't want him to be a writer, but he doesn't want him to be a writer because he's trying to protect him. And before his father's death, his dad says, because this is the end of the line, essentially, for me, you can go out and do those things. Like you can lean into your voice. Because everything changes for him in that moment when his father sees his mortality. He's like, now I have to leave you with something that's going to outlast me, basically. So I think part of it is that Nick just feels like there was a strain in their relationship, and I think that it's a source of guilt and maybe a source of shame for Nick that he never had the chance to fix the strain in the relationship with his father. And part of starting the paper and part of like continuing what his father started is his way of fixing that, even though his father isn't here. So I think that that's what really starts to motivate him because he feels like, he's experienced so much loss, but he wants to make something out of it. He doesn't, he wants to keep going and keep striving despite the pain that he feels and the grief.
And as he goes through this, he wakes up something in Jay
Mm,
and creates a friction between Jay and his father that may not have existed.
mm,
So there's sort of this yin and yang kind of thing that's happening from what Nick's life was to what Nick's life is to what Jay's life was to what Jay's life is. Jay becomes a Black man,
mhm,
where that's not what his father wanted for him. That's not what their community on Long Island would have wanted for him. He
mm,
was sort of a bridge to the Black students like Daisy and others to this other world.
mm,
And now he was closing down that other world to some extent because he no longer felt that he fit for multiple reasons: the color of his skin, the color of his mother's skin, and who he loved. So
mm,
there were so many things now that caused a division. I mean, his father caught him in bed with another man.
mhm.
His father didn't seem to be that upset about it, but he
Yeah.
thought his father was upset about it.
Yeah. I think Nick expected his father to be upset in a way that he wasn't. Because Nick has no context for like that kind of situation, sleeping with someone with a white parent. I mean, white people just annihilated his community. So of course he's going to expect something um, devastating. But I think in that environment in Jay's home, the the tension it's a simmering kind of passive aggressive tension. I don't think it's like a confrontational kind of relationship that Jay and his father have. It's very like, cross your T's, dot your I's, tie your knots. It feels very like he's like primped to be this wealthy young man, but they're not able to have those like honest conversations. Like, like when Nick says to his father early on in the book, like, I don't want a curfew, and his dad is just kind of like, who are you talking to? But at the very least, Nick is able to approach that conversation, in the first place. I don't know that Jay has that safety with his father who can feel kind of detached and is often traveling. And so Jay feels like he's kind of navigating a lot on his own.
And with his father's travels, with his father's business, he knows some of what his father does. He may not know everything that his father does, and he's not fully aware, or is he fully aware of the precarious nature of his father's wealth?
I think he's aware of it. I think that he knows what a teenager would know. I I don't think he I think Jay just wants to be a responsible and good son. And he's like I said, he's used to kind of like going through the motions and following orders. Um, but yeah, I definitely think that in their home, I will admit that I don't know everything that goes on in their home. I think the characters, they take on a life of their own, and it's like, we see what we see of them. But yeah, I think that there are secrets that are not being disclosed, and then there are things that are being said. So yeah, it's just a bit distant between them.
So going back, the book is based on The Great Gatsby, but it's not The Great Gatsby in
Mm.
the in a classical just reboot. It's very, very different. What made you think that that was a great chassis for the car that you were building?
Why the Great Gatsby?
Yes.
Um, it feels, I think that Gatsby itself as symbolism has gone beyond the story itself, because in culture, when we think about Gatsby inspired, like if you have a Gatsby inspired party, what you're expecting is something glamorous, right? You're expecting something glitzy and pretty. And obviously, the novel is about the emptiness underneath that kind of like materialism and that excess. But culturally, I think that Gatsby is shorthand for something desirable. It's like, you can put your tuxedo on. And I think that in terms of like the way that Black characters have been represented historically, not even necessarily like too far in the past, is such that we are relegated to, I don't want to say trauma narratives because I think exploring trauma is important, but narratives that politicize us so heavily that we're not usually able to embody that kind of ritz and that kind of like, we see them going to galas and parties. And for me, there was something important about that representation, about showing that, like, yes, we are in the past, but Black people were having fun too. Black people were getting dressed up too. Black people were going to parties and falling in love. I think that when we look at African American history, sometimes there's a tendency to say everything that was happening, like, you know, in the century before this one was just trauma and bad, and it's not that way. There was still a lot of joy, and I wanted to, like I said, I wanted to reimagine what this classic could look like with the bones of what the original book had, but also represent our history in a way that felt really rich and kind of incorporated the trauma, but also showed that people were having a great time. And it's a really rich tapestry of history that we have in this country.
And what role did LGBTQ play in the book? And how much of that experience from you found its way into the characters and the storyline?
Mm.
Because it's very demure in the beginning,
Hmm. Yeah.
and it does build. Um, but in the beginning, you can say, "I thought this had a gay storyline, and I don't really." And then all of a sudden, it's there. So, how much of you is in that, and how did you decide where to weave it? And is it sort of a slow build because it's a YA novel
Mm.
versus if you were writing an adult book?
Mhm.
There seems to be a lot there and a lot of reasons and a lot of thought and a lot of strategy that went into how you were going to introduce first Nick and then the relationship between Nick and Jay.
Mhm. Yeah, so I definitely wanted to make it feel demure at the beginning just because that environment, like a southern environment, the kind of environment that Nick is from, is not one where they're like necessarily like encouraging young men to come out of the closet, or at least I would not imagine that. But it was really interesting in studying the 1920s and learning that there were, prominent queer figures and there were queer bars and as a part of that expression, like I was talking about how the women were like gaining more autonomy and like freedoms. I think queer people were also gaining similar freedoms at the time and being more comfortable expressing themselves. So I wanted to show that, and you know, for me, I grew up in the South, and I come from a socially conservative background. My parents were very Christian growing up, so that there was no possibility for me to be gay. That just wasn't. It wasn't until I was 19 and I left home that I realized, oh, there's gay people that are out and having a great time. And I learned that in the bars in Atlanta, in the gay bars. So, I still remember going to my first Pride with my friend, and it was both of our first Pride, and we went to New Orleans, and it was just like so freeing because it was like now I have to catch up for all the time that I lost not being able to, have fun like this. So when Nick explores the bars, that's what I was trying to capture, just that freedom where he's like, oh, there's a different way of doing things and this feels better. I don't have to be all closed up about this aspect of who I am because these people are not that way and they are having a great time. So I can do that too.
So he sort of found out that being black was okay and being gay was okay and
Mhm.
all of those things were okay, even though the challenges that he faced were very real.
Hmm. Yeah, and I didn't want it to be like this like slog through that. I wanted it to feel joyful. I think, there's a lot of books that are about the trauma of it, and some of that is in there, but I wanted to celebrate the queerness of the time. I didn't want it to feel like everything is miserable, you know.
No, I don't think that you get that everything is miserable. I think that what's interesting, and you did very well, is when people don't know, you're not necessarily ready to jump up and down and shout it. So Nick wanted to be sure that people knew before he went and told them. Uh, so he kept everything close to the vest. Is he didn't say, "Hi, I'm homosexual," because I don't think
Mhm.
they used gay very much back then. But at the same time, he found out that his cousin didn't care,
Mhm.
and the people that she worked with, Jordan, didn't care. In fact, Jordan was
Mhm.
undoubtedly, the way you wrote her, a lesbian, which she might have been in the original book as well.
Yeah.
Uh, although I don't think that the Dinah Shore classic was the golf tournament of the days of F. Scott Fitzgerald, but and you probably don't even know who Dinah Shore is because it's a long time ago.
Mhm.
But you can look that up.
Okay.
And so that was interesting. And it was interesting because it didn't need to be discussed. It was
Mhm.
written in a way so that you felt that you were just an observer in the room.
Mhm.
And the way they behaved is the way they behaved. And you could read into it or not read into it as you saw fit. But how careful are you in writing for a young audience and knowing that at a time when they're banning books,
Mhm.
that you want your book sold, you want your book read. Um, is that even on your mind
In terms of like
when you're
showing,
writing? When you're writing, how cautious are you in the language that you use, in the descriptive words that you use? Because even when Nick and Jay are intimate, it's very much naive in the
Mhm,
sense of how it's presented to the reader.
mhm,
I mean, you don't talk about the kinds of things that you see in almost every film, and even now more and more on television, in
mhm.
terms of how out there it is.
Yeah.
Uh, you're very Victorian.
Mm, mm. So I actually am a very sex positive person, and following like when I was able to kind of come to grips with my sexuality, I found that out about myself. But I know that when I was in high school reading YA, I never wanted to see sex in the books I was reading. And I remember when I write YA now, I remember that because even if now, like if I watch something or I read something, if I want to see that because I am acquainted with it, um, I didn't have sex until I was like 19, 20. So the characters in the book are 17. Well, I think Jay is, I should know, but I think Jay is 19. Nick turns 18 in the book. So in representing those experiences of intimacy, I wanted to be just cognizant of who I was at the time that the character was. And that's all I can do. Well, I guess I could have technically had them do more explicit things, but I just didn't feel that it was the right moment for that. And maybe if there was a sequel, of course, I'm sure they would, be more sexual with each other. But I felt like their intimacy was complete without it needing too much. And I am a YA writer, so I am cognizant of the craft that goes into doing sex. I think there's a way to do it that isn't gratuitous and isn't like gonna shock a teenager who hasn't had those experiences. So yeah, I want I it's not so much about like censoring it as it is about like being honest and true to like the way that I interacted with sex at the time.
No, that's a great answer. I mean, so it comes out of a lived experience,
Mm,
and
yeah,
you didn't want them to be something for sensation. You wanted them to be real people.
yeah. I actually write romance and erotic romance, so there's a place for that for me. And I don't think that it's this work. Also, it's the 1920s, so things are more buttoned up anyway.
Well, they were and they weren't. The Roaring Twenties were not
Mm,
very buttoned up, but I understand what you're saying. I mean, writing about that period is different than what they might have experienced themselves behind closed doors.
mm, yeah.
But certainly you're dealing with young people, which would have been very different than in the way it would have been vocalized than the way young people are today, or some
Mhm.
young people are today.
Yeah, we're pretty open these days.
So, how do you pick a topic?
Like for
Does
a
it just
novel?
come to you? Yeah.
No, it doesn't just come to me. I wish it did. It actually comes over a period of years. So I knew I wanted to write historical like in 2018, and I started this book in 2022, and it's just now coming out. So it takes a while. It takes, living life, kind of absorbing the truths that I come to, absorbing more about who I am, figuring out what I need to say, I just want to do things that are urgent and timely, but also that are timeless. So I always think like when I come to an idea, and I have a lot of ideas that I don't end up finishing or sending out or submitting because it just feels like I was in an era or I was in a vibe, I was in a mood where I wanted to write this thing, but it's not something that I think when I look back on my books, I would want to have that story. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't take off because I want my work to mean something and I want it to be something that can be read for years to come. So it's a whole process.
And that sounds like a very good place for us to wind down because it's a
Okay.
process. So here's the book, The Great Disillusionment of Nick and Jay. I don't really know how disillusioned they are at the end because they're kind of happy at the end. They make some very good decisions for them.
Mhm.
It's written by Ryan Douglas. This is not his first book. It will not be his last. It will be available here at Stonewall in our library, which is the world's largest LGBTQ library. Yeah, you didn't know that, did you? You
I didn't
didn't do
know
your
that.
homework. We also have one of the few community based nationally collecting archives with, excuse me, millions of documents. So we do hold a lot of the history and culture of our community within these walls here in, of all places, Florida, which under our current administration led the way to Don't Say Gay and book banning. But even with that, we're able to talk with authors who have written important works about our community and other communities because minority and marginalized communities have to find ways of working together if we are all going to achieve the better world that we all aim for. So, this is Stonewall National Museum, Archive, and Library. We do many different programs. We have all kinds of events and we do exhibits in our museum. Right now, we have Wonder Woman, we have a button collection, and we have an exhibit on the life of Bayard Rustin and the work that he did with Martin Luther King on creating the March on Washington that resulted in the I Have a Dream speech. So, those are our three current exhibits. We will be preparing soon for our Women's History Month exhibit and then Pride. And on February 21st, we will host our fourth Standing on the Shoulders of Heroes Gala, where we will induct former excuse me, former Congressman Barney Frank, Grammy Award winner, singer-songwriter Janice Ian, and philanthropist John Stryker, who since 2020 has contributed over $700 million to charities. So we are very excited about that event. We're excited about the people that we'll be honoring. And we welcome you to visit Stonewall anytime and think of it as your home away from home. And hopefully, Ryan, you'll visit us as well.
I
And
would
thank you
love it.
very much for your thank you so much for your time and for your book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It's a huge honor.
My pleasure. Anytime. Have a good night, everybody, and thank you. And just so you know, this will then be prepared and edited a little bit and will go up on YouTube on our and be part of our permanent digital collection.
Awesome. Sounds
So you'll
good.
be there for posterity.
Okay. That's exciting.
Have a great night.